Good morning and welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. It is Tuesday, February 21st at 10 a.m. and we are here this morning for an allowable ex parte briefing by the Office of Regulatory Staff on the South Carolina Electric Vehicle Stakeholder Initiative Report. Let's take appearances. Who's here for the Office of Regulatory Staff?
Madam Chair, Vice Chair Powers, members of the Commission, good morning. My name is Nicole Given. I'm a staff attorney at the Office of Regulatory Staff, and with me today to provide the briefing is our Chief Operating Officer, Ms. Dawn Hipp.
Thank you, Ms. Given. And as ORS is providing the briefing, our neutral this morning is Mr. John Regal. Good morning, Mr. Regal.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Thank you for being here. I'm going to recognize our staff counsel, Mr. David Stark, to lay some groundwork for us before we begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, other commissioners, and all who are present, we are here in the Commission's hearing room pursuant to a notice of request for an allowable ex parte communication briefing on the South Carolina Electric Vehicle Stakeholder Initiative Report. The subject matter to be discussed at the briefing today is related to ND-2022-76-E. This is a briefing and not a hearing, and the briefing must be conducted in compliance with the provisions of South Carolina Code Section 58-3-260C. The requirements of that statute are, in part, that the allowable ex parte be confined to the subject matter which has been noticed. I therefore ask that the presenter, commissioners, and staff all please refrain from discussing any matters not related to this specific topic. The statute prohibits any presenter, commissioners, or commission staff from requesting or giving any commitment, predetermination, or prediction regarding any action by any commissioner as to any ultimate or penultimate issue which either is or is likely to come before the commission. I would ask that the presenter, commissioners, and staff refrain from referencing any report, article, statute, or documents of any kind that are not included in today's presentation. A copy of any such document which is referenced during the briefing must be provided to the Office of Regulatory Staff for inclusion in the record, which will be certified to the Chief Clerk of the Commission, Ms. Jocelyn Boyd. Finally, everyone in attendance today must sign in or register, and everyone in the hearing room must also read, sign, and return the form which you were given at the door when you came in today. It is required for each attendee to certify that the requirements contained in Section 58-3-260C have been complied with at this presentation. I thank you all for your time and attention. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stark. Ms. Given or Mr. Regal, any additions or objections to the instructions thus given?
No additions from ORS.
No addition.
Thank you. I neglected to take the roll call of commissioners, so let's do that this time. With us virtually, we have Commissioner Irvin, and present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Jay Williams, Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner C. Williams, Commissioner Caston, and Chair Belser. And with that, we will recognize Ms. Hipp and welcome you.
Well, good morning and welcome back after a long weekend. You get a Monday and a Tuesday, all in Tuesday, with very beautiful weather, I might add. Coming from Minnesota this weekend, I can tell you that it's much colder up there, still beautiful, and they're getting lots of snow. So I'm glad to be here talking with you about our Electric Vehicle Stakeholder Initiative. Let me introduce myself. My name is Dawn Hipp. I'm the Chief Operating Officer with the Office of Regulatory Staff. And one of my duties is to work directly with our state's energy office, which, as you know, is a part of the Office of Regulatory Staff. And so today you've asked me to speak on the Electric Vehicle Stakeholder Initiative, which the Energy Office initiated in 2018 and 2020. Just an outline of the presentation today. We're going to talk at a high level of the items that you can find in the report, and we'll provide a link to the report on slide 3 for you. We've handed you the presentation materials and a real brief overview of the report and the recommendations. And so we'll focus at that kind of high level of the report. It's a real easy read, only 34 pages if you don't count all the appendices, but don't skip those because they're very important. So take a look at the appendices on your own time when you have an opportunity to access the report. If you like, I'll go ahead and do the presentation. You can ask me questions throughout or questions at the end. That'll be your choice. So if that works for you, we will start off here. There we go. Just to give you an overview, the Energy Office very quickly is a very small office within the ORS. We have about 7 employees, not counting our support staff and interns. And the initiative that we're talking about today was undertaken by the Energy Office. It was really designed to be a collaborative statewide discussion on the possibilities of EV deployment, to take a look at the impacts of the legislative and regulatory environment on EVs and the deployment of EV charging stations, their access and adoption, and then to really look at the challenges. This is a stakeholder initiative. This was not an Energy Office determination of what the plan should be, but an opportunity to gather with about 350 stakeholders to discuss EVs. The time frame for this, as I had mentioned, started in 2018, coming out of a commission docket on an electric transportation pilot filed by Duke Energy. ORS on the regulatory side convened a stakeholder group to discuss what was going on and what had been filed by Duke Energy. And what we quickly realized is that there were more policy, legislative, environmental discussions than could be had, within the contents of those dockets filed at the commission. So we determined that the Energy Office would be the appropriate place to convene a stakeholder initiative, and we launched that in 2020 with the help of Duke University's Nicholas Institute. They facilitated the collaborative discussions, and ORS Energy Office and the advisory committee set up the construct of that. What's in the report? Again, a short 34-page read. The report contains an overview of the stakeholder initiative, the working group recommendations, background on EV trends, proposed next steps coming out of the collaborative work of the stakeholders, and then various appendices, as I mentioned to you, that are not to be missed. They debunk the myths of EV ownership. They talk about EV development in the Southeast and nationally. So you'll definitely want to take a look at that. And you can see that I provided a link in the footnote that is operable. It'll take you right to the report. Part 1 of the report identifies that we worked with a diverse stakeholder group. And that diverse stakeholder group identified the guiding factors that would influence the stakeholder initiative. The sectors that made up the stakeholder group included approximately 24% government entities, 21% nonprofits, and 16% utilities. And the rest of the percentages were made up of EV manufacturers. Of course, we are home to many EV manufacturers. You've heard those announcements. Charging infrastructure, charging ownership companies, companies with large fleets, such as Benor Logistics in the upstate, and then groups that are focused on energy equity, energy justice, and accessibility for underrepresented communities, such that they can participate in EV deployment. The guiding factors that helped lead the working groups, and the 5 working groups, as you can see here, are EV infrastructure, incentives and financing, education, outreach, workforce development, public entities, and equity and accessibility. While I ended with equity and accessibility, we quickly determined that equity and accessibility pervade the other working groups. And so while it had its own working group to have those discussions centralized on equity and accessibility, you'll notice in the recommendations and the work of the other working groups that that discussion was top of mind. Act 46 followed the stakeholder initiative, if you look at the timeline that's included in the report, in 2021, the General Assembly passed Act 46, and what it did was carve out the notion that charging station operators were not defined as electric utilities. And the distinction is such that it follows the policy in several other states. The importance of that is that electric charging, third parties who own electric charging sites, whether it be at a Quick Trip or in the library parking lot, as you see here in Richland County, those entities are not classified as a public utility under Title 58. They can also now charge for the charging service based on the kilowatt hour. Act 46 also established a joint committee on the electrification of transportation to conduct studies and make recommendations to the General Assembly to enable a fair, efficient, and cost-effective transition to electric transportation. Act 46 directed the ORS Energy Office to continue the stakeholder initiative that they had started in 2020 and provide those recommendations coming out of the electric EV stakeholder initiative back to this committee by no earlier than July 1st, 2022. The report is those recommendations. It was provided to the General Assembly's committee following Act 46 in September of 2022. Coming out of Act 46, the Energy Office is required to reconvene the stakeholders, whether that's this group of stakeholders or amended group of stakeholders due to any other policy changes. The Energy Office will be convening that group every 2 years and reporting the results of those meetings. And then finally, as you're aware, Act 46 directed the PSC. It had a little bit of work for you that no earlier than April of 2023, you open a docket to study things, to identify the regulatory challenges and opportunities. And then finally, Act 46 directed the Department of Revenue to provide annual reports to the Joint Committee about revenue streams and the transition to electrification and how that impacts the revenue for DOT to maintain our roadways. I'm on slide 5. The recommendations are listed in part 2 of the report, and it is broken down by each of the 5 working groups, as you can see listed on the screen. I've given you just a little snapshot of what those recommendations look like, the format. So as you're flipping through the report on your computer, you'll be able to see the format and really understand what the advisory committee and the stakeholders are trying to convey. You'll see a number, that's the number of the recommendation. The recommendation itself, just a real concise sentence with hopefully an action verb in it. Hopefully you see that. The what, what is it? What type of actions are we trying to accomplish, and why are we doing it? And it was very important to the stakeholders to have in this report the what and the why, so that policymakers or champions of certain recommendations would know exactly where that stakeholder group was headed. So what you'll see in the report are the top 5 recommendations from each one of the working groups. Some of them do have more than 5, some have less than 5. It'll give you a little bit more insight into what they were thinking when they were developing the recommendation. Throughout 2021, our stakeholder groups met. So if you look at the timeline, we identified there was a need for the stakeholder initiative in 2019. In early 2020, we meaning the Energy Office, was putting a bit of framework around that. How are we going to accomplish this? What should it look like? Who should be involved? Again, the pandemic hit. And then in late 2020, we began with our meetings And in 2021, the working group, we transferred the responsibility for all of the work, so to speak, into the working groups, each led by a subject matter expert, and asked them to do some of that hard work, meeting on their schedule, again, facilitated by members of the Energy Office and the Duke University Nicholas Institute. So while they were meeting in 2021, they were identifying relevant research and information sources, because believe it or not, the knowledge field on EVs was not, not everyone was at the same level of knowledge. And some folks, had knowledge about how infrastructure works, but not knowledge about rate design issues. And so it was important that we built the knowledge in an equitable manner such that you could have that conversation to develop recommendations. Those working groups also consider the challenges associated with electrification of transportation and then develop the recommendations. One of the disclaimers we like to talk about when we're talking about the recommendations is that they were not all consensus-based. So all of the recommendations are reflected in the Stakeholder Initiative report, but they are not all consensus recommendations. In part 3 of the report, you will see a background on EV trends. Here in South Carolina, there's several pages that talk about what is going on up to the date of our report issuance, which is September 2022 in South Carolina. What's happening in the Southeast, we're really interested in what other states that have state energy offices were working on, and our state energy office was part of those coalitions, and then what nationally is influencing policy and development of EVs. The pictures that you see are wonderful. A wonderful depiction of our work out of the Energy Office. In the middle, you see a group of our Energy Office employees and a representative from Rivian, which is the electric truck maker. That was taken here in 2022 when Rivian installed the first charging station at Dreher Island, and they did a ribbon cutting. Rivian will be providing and rolling out electric vehicle charging stations at each of our state parks, and that partnership between parks, recreation, and tourism was facilitated directly by the Energy Office. So they're smiling. It was a while in the making, and so you can see that there. And then in the upper, which would be my right corner, is our Energy Office full EV. That's a Chevy Bolt. We've wrapped it so you can see that it's an EV with the plug-in SC markings. You'll see it around town. It is very fun to drive. We were the first state agency to have a full EV in our fleet of vehicles. And we then worked with state procurement to make sure that other state agencies had an opportunity to purchase EVs or lease EVs on state contract. Moving on to part 4 of the report, this is just a quick overview of the proposed next steps. The working groups facilitated 27 recommendations from those 5 working groups, and the advisory committee, which was made up of a subsection of the stakeholders, helped the Energy Office kind of classify, if you will, into 4 groups the recommendations and next steps. So we're going to take a look at each group individually, because I think you can talk about a lot of things, but if you don't do them, it's not worth very much. So we're interested in what the doing looks like coming out of the stakeholder engagement. One of the proposed next steps requires legislative consideration. When the Energy Office and the advisory committee looked at the work of the 5 working groups, we quickly noticed that the Energy Office could not implement statewide policy or continued collaboration on its own. And there were several items that would require a deeper dive on the legislative front. Those items were classified as legislative items because they are cross-cutting against multiple state agencies. Some of them require financial incentives potentially for consideration, and municipal and local governments would need to participate in those efforts. The five kind of general items that you'll see in the report under the legislative considerations are equity and environmental justice items, items that it would be positive to South Carolina to boost resiliency in times of weather events, whether they be winter weather or hurricanes. Accessibility, looking at those rural areas or underrepresented communities to make sure that they have opportunities to participate should they desire in owning an EV or having an EV charger. Finance opportunities such as tax credits, certain types of tax incentives that could be offered to EV owners, and then some larger planning considerations. Moving on to slide 9. Let's talk a minute about the statewide public-private collaboration. What the stakeholders are looking for is continued collaboration amongst government entities and then also nonprofits and private for-profit entities. It is going to take everyone in the state to come up with a statewide roadmap. And so that was one of the items, to assemble a neutral statewide committee to facilitate continued honest EV conversations, providing a forum for factual communication of expert information, and identifying solutions and develop tools and programs for the EV industry. As you know, our EV industry and the impact on economic development in South Carolina is very strong. You've seen, quite a few announcements in the paper related to that, and this statewide public-private collaboration would focus on that. It is further supported by the executive order issued by Governor McMaster in October of 2022. Some other items that this group might work on would be potential rate designs for EVs, because not only is rate design important to utilities, but it is incredibly important to the consumer of utility type services, whether you're a site host or you are actually plugging in your vehicle. Creation of an EV workforce development plan, that also is represented in Governor McMaster's executive order, and identifying incentives and financing opportunities. And some of those incentives and financing opportunities can be privately sponsored. Moving on to slide 10, talking a little bit about the statewide electrification roadmap, which is going to take continued collaboration amongst all of the parties. This is an item that is designed out of the working groups to attract and advance economic development opportunities in EV manufacturing, workforce development, EV infrastructure, and sales. The important part of the electrification roadmap is the development of some sort of goals for state agencies and others involved in the deployment of EVs and EV infrastructure. Right now, the state does not have certain goals. You do see that in other states, and that will be something for this working group or continued collaborators to work through. The other items that this group and the group of champions would work on would be to develop voluntary minimum standards for EV charging infrastructure and design. Someone traversing our state, maybe coming up from Georgia and headed to Virginia on 95, wants to know that when they see certain signage and when they pull into EV chargers that they're going to receive the service that is advertised. And sometimes EV chargers, have varying types of standards. And so voluntary minimum standards in the state of South Carolina might be helpful there. To prioritize the EV infrastructure deployment along critical corridors such as evacuation routes and in coordination with public and private efforts, you had a presentation a few weeks ago about from DOT related to their deployment efforts. And so it will build on that. And to ensure that passenger EV availability is available throughout South Carolina. When you look in the report, you will see some maps that demonstrate deployment in 2016 of charging infrastructure and where folks with EV chargers reside or where those vehicles are registered. And you'll also see the end of 2021, a same map with those penetrations. You'll notice a very large uptick between 2016 and 2021, as you would expect. They are centralized in the urban areas. So you'll see a large focus in Columbia, Charleston, Greenville, and then actually in the Rock Hill area. On slide 11, we're talking about the statewide EV awareness effort, and this is one that the Energy Office claimed for itself and will be taking the lead on given the additional federal funding that it will receive in the near future. The components of the EV awareness effort include education and outreach initiatives, and that can be both to communities, to EV, potential EV owners, public entities, local governments. We are doing that now in the Energy Office. To educate public entities, to create an information hub, a one-stop shop, if you will. Anyone looking for resources and links to what state agencies touch EV deployment or EVs, where you can find the EV dealerships, the incentives that are available for EV owners, and we will be working on that information hub in collaboration with some other state agencies. And finally, we'll conduct public outreach and equity discussions along with our partners in the equity and environmental justice arenas. Coming out of the statewide EV awareness effort, the Energy Office hopes to develop an brand agnostic EV awareness campaign, such that it's a government-led initiative where you can get all of the information, not just the information that maybe Chevy wants you to have or your community wants you to have, something broader than that. On page 12, that's just an identification of what you'll find in the appendices. You'll find the stakeholder process details, all of the ins and outs of how the stakeholder process that culminated in the report were developed and how they were navigated with a nice timeline that I've mentioned. We also surveyed our stakeholders, and you'll find the results of the survey in that section of the appendices. You'll find notable state activities. In there, there will be some things that you maybe didn't know were ongoing in the early adopter space and the 2019-2020 space. You'll find some information on general environmental concerns, the myths about EVs, the facts about EVs, information on their battery life and use. And again, that is an ever-changing area. We provided just some basic information to help folks should they have environmental concerns, but that information will be evolving. And then just the basics on EVs. Folks may not recognize the difference between an internal combustion engine vehicle or maybe a hybrid plug-in and then a full-on battery. And so the times that it takes to charge, the levels of charging that are available and the difference between those, where to find charging infrastructure and what the lingo is related to charging infrastructure, and then helpful links if folks want to learn more about those. And finally, on slide 15, what you can see is what the Energy Office will work on next. And so we'll be working on the statewide EV awareness effort. And we've listed 3 items: conducting education and outreach, creating the one-stop shop or the hub to help folks looking for information about EVs, from economic development to education to location, and then promoting equity throughout all of South Carolina communities and sectors. We'll be working on the requirements under Act 46. And then in October of 2022, I mentioned the governor had issued an executive order. It set up 3 different working groups or initiatives. The Energy Office will work with all 3. One is centralized on economic development initiatives, and Commerce will head that. The second one is headed by the Department of Transportation, and we are serving on the interagency working group with DOT as a partner. Part of their work there relates to the infrastructure deployment requirements coming from the federal government. And then finally, the Department of Employment and Workforce is heading a working group to develop workforce training. There is a training gap between traditional mechanics and how to service electric vehicles, and so they'll be working to train folks on that. And you can access both Act 46 through the links that I provided in the presentation, and also Governor McMaster's executive order issued in October 2022 through the link. And with that, I will pause for questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hipp. Commissioners, questions? Vice Chair Powers?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning to both of you, and thank you for all the work apparently y'all have put into this program and into this overwhelming situation with electric vehicles. I noticed you used the word trending, and some of us were in a conference last week in Washington, and a lot of the sessions had to do with electric vehicles, and the word trending was, in there. One thing I heard, though, that kind of made my ears perk up was one of the speakers said that and I want to say it was 5 years or sometime in the near future, that the electric vehicles will cause an add of 15 kilowatts in order to function, but that we would only have 3 kilowatts developed. And I think the term he used was that we got the cart in front of the horse, because people really like the idea of electric vehicles. They like the idea of clean energy. And he said there's some sort of misconception that, well, we'll have electric vehicles, we'll have solar power to run them all. The other thing I learned or have learned as a commissioner is, we don't get involved in policy. Many of the different commissions do and have active roles, just as our Department of Energy Office does. That disparity, of course, is a big concern for everybody. Is that part of what one of these groups is addressing as far as power?
Yeah, yes, it is. Yeah, one of the working groups on infrastructure in particular had robust discussions about how to bridge the gap. What improvements would be necessary for the power grid, not just the investor-owned utilities that are regulated by this commission, but Santee Cooper, the electric co-op distribution facilities will require some upgrades. The trends are in some areas of the country where you see states mandating a transition away from fossil fuel vehicles, or gas vehicles, over to electric vehicles. I think that critical grid improvements are necessary. That might be a cart before the horse situation. Here in South Carolina, what we're seeing, the planning that the utilities are doing, you're seeing already them planning for EV growth in their IRPs that come before the commission. And it's a reasonable growth. South Carolina rarely is the first on things like this, and that's not a bad thing. I think I heard Mr. Biedenbaugh say the other day before you, we don't want to be on the bleeding edge of some of these items. We'd like to take lessons learned in some cases and be thoughtful about our approach, and I wholeheartedly agree to that. But those grid discussions, grid improvements, do we have generation? Those conversations will continue. They'll continue under Act 46. They'll actually continue here at the commission under Act 46, if I read that correctly.
Yeah. And Act 46 is heading in the direction that, there's a lot of good in it. Is there anything further that you think the legislature should do, or has the group come up with any plan or looking for anything as far as policy from the legislature?
Not necessarily, not in the infrastructure area. The utilities tend to take reasonable measured approaches to development of the grid and distribution and transmission improvements that are necessary. And in the report, you will see that the Public Service Commission is mentioned several times. And so I think the stakeholders, again, this was a stakeholder driven initiative, the stakeholders felt that the commission, would have the ability when these issues arise to navigate through some of that.
Yeah. Well, and you're aware of the code of conduct, that the judicial code of conduct, that, we're limited in some things. But I think this is very exciting, and I certainly appreciate what all you've done on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Commissioner Justin Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Hipp, thank you for joining us this morning. You always do a great job in your presentations, and I enjoy listening to them. I hate I didn't have your report before me while you were going through it. I spend so much time in front of a computer these days. I hate looking at them on my phone or on the computer, but hopefully we'll get a copy in soon to review it, maybe even while you're here. Couple acknowledgments I want to make. I want to thank you for working, or the Energy Office, for working with the Nicholas Institute at Duke. I found both the Nicholas Institute and Duke University to be pretty cutting edge when it comes to matters in these areas, especially environmental matters and energy matters. And to that end, there is a lot of science and a lot of technology talk in energy generally. Specifically, we're talking about EVs here. But I've noticed in some of my coursework that sometimes science and technology are way more advanced than existing laws and policy. Can you talk to us a bit about the economic impact of EVs, especially when it comes to tax revenue for our roads?
I admittedly cannot. That is not an area of my expertise. Several of the stakeholders within the group were from the Department of Revenue and also from our State Department of Transportation. And those were top of mind concerns for them. Given the trajectory that we've seen and the transition, it seems that it will be a slow process moving from the gas tax, so to speak, into something else. But I can't quantify for you, and I don't believe our stakeholder initiative could quantify the impact on that specific aspect. And our stakeholder discussions will continue to discuss that piece of it.
Thank you, ma'am. I understand your answer, and I'm not trying to ask the same question, but just want to maybe see if I can solicit a high-level acknowledgement. Is it fair to say that at some point the issue of EVs and contribution to our road tax will have to be addressed in some way by someone somewhere?
Yes, Commissioner.
All right.
And if I might add, that is one aspect of Act 46 as well. The joint committee will be looking at that, and that is part of the function of the report of the Department of Revenue to the joint committee, such that they can show the joint committee what is going on in the gas tax revenue as we see folks migrate from gas-powered vehicles to EVs.
Okay, thank you for that. That report, is that completed yet or yet to be published?
I did not find it as I was preparing for this, so I don't know.
In my experience, most systems, whether it's healthcare, education, military, has some level of planning, 5, 10, 15, 20-year planning, IRP planning. And usually there's a vision or a goal for what that system or institution wants to look like within that time period. And sometimes there are key leaders in certain areas. Is there a key leader in the nation when it comes to what good looks like for EVs?
It's a very good question. You know, some states have accomplished success criteria by setting benchmarks. And that was one of the discussions and one of the recommendations that came out of the stakeholder working group, that it would be helpful to set goals. In South Carolina, what we have seen in the past is that goal setting tends to be done within the stakeholder arena. If you can reach consensus on goal setting in the stakeholder arena, then sometimes you see that result in policy coming from the General Assembly. And so the vision was that the stakeholder group, in their work after the report was finalized, would identify if goals were necessary, and if so, what goals should be set.
Understanding all the science and technology supporting reducing GHG emissions, is there anyone in the stakeholder group that is taking a market-based approach regarding the transition from fossil-fueled vehicles to EVs?
Can I ask a clarifying question? When you say market-based approach, what do you mean by that?
Consumer behavior driven by willingness to pay as opposed to government incentives.
I want to be cautious because I don't want to get into information that's not contained in part of the report. In the appendices, though, in the report, it does mention that a market analysis was done by the Energy Office in the 2019 timeframe to see, what consumers were looking for and what might trigger their behavior going forward. I didn't bring that with me today. As far as greenhouse gas emission reduction, those types of analysis and review will be done necessarily out of the Department of Health and Environmental Control here. The Energy Office does not measure or monitor greenhouse gas emissions except as reporting them or compiling information from other sources. So I think you'll see that coming out of the Department of Health and Environmental Control, and they were part of the stakeholder initiative.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll take some time and look at that that market analysis. So the point of my question, I want to clarify it a little bit. I'm not necessarily concerned about the greenhouse gas emissions. That science sort of speaks for itself, and there are those who are proponents and opponents in that area. I'm more so interested in, is there any thought about whether or not consumers will actually transition as expected, considering whatever the cost may be to transition? My understanding that one of the many benefits of electrification is a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. That's one of the benefits. Setting that benefit to the side, let's say arguably someone was agnostic to the benefits that exist there, is there any reason for a consumer to transition to an EV versus maintaining traditional fossil fueled vehicles?
Yep, I understand what you're saying. There are, there are studies that relate to consumer behavior. What we have seen in general in working directly with consumers and the consumer stakeholder participation in the stakeholder group is that consumers are interested in reducing their carbon footprint first and foremost, but that does not outweigh the cost, the personal cost. And so until the vehicles themselves come down in pricing or are supported by government initiatives, which we're seeing that begin on the federal side and also somewhat on the state side, until that playing field is level or the cost of a traditional gas vehicle goes up, then consumers are going to, in the end, opt for what financially makes sense to them. And most consumers have easy access to gas supplies. Gas prices are coming down. Electric vehicle prices have not come down to the point that gas vehicles are being offered into the marketplace. And so I think until we get that kind of level playing field where it's one or the other, and I feel comfortable with the charging infrastructure, which will be, the deployment of that will take until begin in 2024 and maybe finalize in 2026 under DOT's plan, you will see consumers gravitate towards what financially makes sense for them.
Thank you, ma'am. My last question for you. Is there any vision for the future that the Energy Office has regarding the electrification of transportation in our state?
In terms of vision, the Energy Office has been a early mover in alternative fuels, and not just electrification. So I know electrification is a sexy topic right now, but the Energy Office actually has been working in alternative fuels at least since 2015 when I started working with them, and prior to that. And so they were shouting into the wilderness and nobody was answering back, and they're thrilled to talk about electric vehicles. They're going to talk to you about propane. They're going to talk to you about natural gas, hydrogen, if that ever becomes, an opportunity. And so I think their vision was to get policymakers, decision makers, and the industries who could benefit from alternative fuels to grab onto it, pick it up, and run with it. And so we're at that point. Our vision has been realized such that people are now paying attention, whatever triggered it. Folks such as decision makers and also consumers are paying attention to it. And so the work's not done, but we're very pleased to make a handover to folks that care deeply about alternative fuels and in particular electrification.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Caston?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning.
Good morning.
On slide 6, where you show the nice photo, by the way, of the charging station at the, I think you said Deer Island,
Yes, this one is at Deer Island.
and they're either installing or have installed a charging station at every state park.
They will be working on that project. I believe it is set to they will have one installed by the end of 2024 in each of the state parks.
Okay, that answers one question.
Yes.
And I was trying to scan through the report real quick, and I realized I can't do that and pay attention. So I quit.
Well, I appreciate that.
Well, I quit. But would the report, or does the report, do you know, have information? Like one of my first thoughts when I saw that picture was, who maintains that? Does it have that information?
It does not. It does not speak to the Rivian initiative directly. It mentions it. It mentions it in the state notable items. So under Part 3, under South Carolina, you will see a discussion about Rivian. A couple things I can add to that is they are completely free to the state. These are donated by Rivian and will be maintained by Rivian for a period of time under an agreement with the Department of Park, Recreation, and Tourism. At a certain point, those chargers will be provided to the state at no cost, and the state will need to maintain those.
Okay, thank you. And as I was flipping through pages real quickly before I decided I need to stop, I was actually looking for like the stakeholder group or anything. Is any of that included?
It is. It is included. I believe it's included in the appendices. So one of the first appendices identifies who is on the stakeholder group, not people by name, but the organizations which they represent.
Good enough. I did see the advisory committee.
Right. And in the report, we'll have a delineation of the advisory committee, and then I believe in the appendices, there will be a full slate of all of the participating entities in the stakeholder initiative.
Thank you. Because I was looking at I guess slide 2, where you describe the objectives of this, and I was, trying to get that in my head, and then I was thinking, okay, what groups would be on that, or what group should be that? And you mentioned consumer, I guess consumer/customer and that kind of thing. And it just didn't leap out at me, but again, I fanned through it, so I've looked forward to going through this report in more detail. I appreciate it. You did a wonderful job.
Thank you.
Presenting. Thank you very much.
If I can build on that very good question,
Yes.
Commissioner Caston, the 350 participants in the stakeholder group, a large percentage of those individuals were also EV owners. So I don't know the percentage, but a lot of them actually owned EVs. And when the advisory committee helped kind of frame what the working group's topics should be, the general topics, the stakeholders were given an opportunity to choose a working group that they could provide subject matter expertise into, that they found most interesting, or that they could champion potentially the outcome. And so the stakeholders themselves kind of place themselves into the working groups, and that worked out very nicely.
Okay, well, I guess along those lines, and I'll look at it in more detail, thinking about one of Commissioner Justin Williams' questions about an agnostic view. If, just kind of curious, and I'll look at the stuff to see, okay, would there be anyone on there with an agnostic view? In other words, it would be pro this or pro that, and that's...
It's a very good question. I think that's what the Energy Office brings, given that EVs are just one of the alternative fuels that the Energy Office brings to the table. Commissioner Williams talked about the good work of Duke University, Nicholas Institute. They have facilitated stakeholder working groups for the Energy Office prior to this. That's why we knew their reputation. They helped us with the energy efficiency roadmap. And so they provide an agnostic view and provided subject matter experts from across the country to speak to, issues and to kind of keep it at that level. Absolutely, within the working groups, there were folks that were pro and con, or had interests that were representative of their business interests, which is very, very valuable, because when you're looking for recommendations, you're standing in the middle of a circle, and you have to consider everyone's views as you're trying to kind of synthesize the recommendation that will come out of the group.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hipp. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Commissioner Caston. Commissioner Thomas?
Thank you. And thank you for the excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I just have, I think, one kind of a question. So about the only thing I could read and focus on what you were saying was the executive summary. So
That's why we do it.
Perfect, perfect. So I'm going to kind of jump off with a question from there. So you have a section there that talks about legislative considerations and actions, which you also talked about in your presentation. And that one, you talk about equity, areas that are disproportionately impacted by vehicle-related health and noise impacts. And under that same section, another bullet point, accessibility, ensure passenger EV availability and affordability throughout South Carolina. And then the statewide public-private collaboration, another section. You mentioned, and there's a bullet point about rate designs. And I guess basically what I'm thinking about is just hearing or learning a little bit more about how the rate design and the affordability throughout South Carolina, if there's any more you can say about that. I guess my concern is we do have a lot of low-income people in South Carolina, and this could be a very complicated transition, and just trying to figure out how all of that comes together for not to overburden low-income people. Is there anything you can say about that?
Well, I can say, based on the stakeholder initiative, it is interesting when you bring together different champions in all of the arenas that you just read off. There are all these wonderful ideas that bubble up to the top. And the real sledgehammer that comes to the table is, well, how do we pay for that? That is something that kind of takes the good idea and brings it back to reality, because when you're looking at the ideas of the stakeholders, one thing that the stakeholders expressed was, look, it shouldn't, all of these items, the cost should not, there are societal benefits on electrification, the transition to electrification in the transportation sector. And so you saw South Carolina DHEC bring to the table a discussion about higher levels of pollution in areas around the port or in areas around the inland port, for instance. And the communities that are situated in those areas are disproportionately impacted. So if we transition to electrification and our carbon emissions are reduced, that will automatically benefit them. If at the same time you're layering financial incentive that these individuals will pay for an EV that they will never own, is that right? What is the balance test that is provided through that? And how do you quantify the societal benefit of reduced carbon emissions? Those are things that the stakeholder group, even though it went on from kind of 2020 through 2021, they did not stop and do quantification or calculations within the stakeholder groups. Those will be things that they will leave to the experts coming out of that in the four kind of next step areas that we discussed. We do have affordable electric rates here in South Carolina comparatively to other parts of the country. As you increase grid capacity, distribution, transmission, and generation, does that trigger an affordability threshold that make using an EV more expensive than a petroleum vehicle? And so we'll have to continue to look at that carefully. I don't have an answer to that question, but it's kind of this balancing test. And then if you layer complicated rates, when I plug in my vehicle and the rates are 5 parts, or I go home and I plug my vehicle in and all of a sudden my bill has 5 parts to it, that's not necessarily a good price signal. Or one of the rates is a premium for plugging in my vehicle because I have a vehicle. Well, that's not going to promote development of EVs and frankly, will be unattractive in the financial sense. So that was a lot to say. I don't know the answer to that question, and we will be working on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Commissioners, anything further?
Chair Belzer,
Commissioner Carolee Williams?
thank you. Good to have you here. And
you.
to add to what my colleagues have said, this, in addition to the presentation, the document itself is just graphically easy to read.
Oh,
and
thank you.
Given the other materials that we read, no offense to everybody else, and the idea that it's 34 pages is very attractive to me.
I really appreciate hearing that because our energy office team is supported by an ORS. We have a graphic design specialty on staff, and her name is Marlena, and she did a beautiful job with this. It took us a while, but just the layout and the ability to digest it, that's what we want. Someone will pick it up if you see it laying around and not say, oh, that's a boring government report. I don't want to look at it. So thank you for that.
Kudos to Marlene.
She did a wonderful job.
Okay. One of the questions that I've been asking and others have been asking, and you may or may not know it, is in Act 46, there's a statement related to the PSC and opening the docket no sooner than April 1st, 2023. Do you have any idea what the purpose was behind that timing?
Yes, I do. Because the timing was important because of the other dates that were listed in Act 46. And in particular, giving enough time for our report coming out of the Energy Office Stakeholder Initiative to hit the street and be digested. What we didn't want to happen was what happened in 2019, where the commission had a series of dockets on electrification for Duke Energy. We didn't want the commission to have to start from ground zero in the discussion under Act 46. So that's why the date is set to give enough time to get this report out without pushing the working groups, in a quick direction where the result, they wouldn't have fully formed recommendations, then providing it to the stakeholders and lawmakers such that they could look at it before the commission started its work under Act 46. So that's why you see the timing the way it is.
I'm really glad I asked.
Yeah.
Related to that and related to the report, are there specific recommendations that the PSC should be taking into consideration once we open that docket that are in the report?
I don't believe so. So Act 46 really outlines the items for the commission to take a look at. They're very well aligned with the report. You'll see when you have an opportunity to take a look at the recommendations closer that there aren't any that say the PSC shall. Because frankly, the PSC, this is a statewide look, and so the PSC is one part of that. And folks had acknowledged as they were doing the recommendations that you would have your work cut out for you under Act 46. So they were careful not to be overly prescriptive. I would imagine in the discussions under Act 46 that you would be looking at the recommendations coming out and seeing kind of what touches the issues that you'll discuss. But other than that, I don't know. That was the discussion in the stakeholder group.
Okay. As the EV infrastructure group works further, might there be recommendations that evolve out of that group?
I believe, given the Governor McMaster's executive order, given DOT's work on the electrification infrastructure rollout under the federal law, I don't believe we will convene working groups necessarily as the Energy Office in the meantime. We will let those stakeholder groups kind of carry with them some of the recommendations from the stakeholder initiative. So I don't think separately you will see anything come out of the Energy Office at this time. Just want to, stakeholders get, they get over stakeholdered, if that's even a term, so you have to be very careful on their, sometimes single person shops, and they need time to work on other initiatives. And so I don't know that you will see anything further from that. Now you may see something come, from the Joint Transportation Group. I don't know.
Okay. The picture of Dreher Island and the Rivian investment, In a former life, my job was to go through the parking garage at the city of Charleston and make sure that they were on and push the recharge button for the early EVs that were installed there through Plug-in Carolina. But city of Charleston was not associated at all with Plug-in Carolina. So my question is building on Commissioner Caston's, not from maintaining the actual, coming in and maintaining them, but who will be responsible in the state park system for ensuring that they're not that they can, that they, to know whether they're working or not? Is that something that a user would identify on an app, or would a state employee identify, hey, we've got a bad signal here?
Yeah. So there's two ways. It will be the ranger and the ranger staff responsibility to check it, to make sure it's used, and that it is. And there's a sharing of data. I understand there's a sharing of data between Rivian, the owner of it, and the park ranger staff in general. And so if something's not working, it'll be the ranger that phones it in. But as we know in the EV community, if you own an EV, those EV owners are connected, as you know, whether they're using an app. I've got one on my phone for when I drive the state vehicle, and I can tell reported by other users if charging stations are not operating or operating correctly. And so I would imagine that those they would communicate that way. We do have the Energy Office has funded 3 chargers in state parks throughout the state as a test pilot, and we did that several years ago. And we work closely with the park rangers on making sure that they're operable. Now, those are free to the public. And so if you go to Sesqui, you can see one of the chargers that the Energy Office had installed on behalf of the park.
I wonder how many rangers thought that would be a part of their job description.
They're excited about it.
That's great.
And so in talking with the park ranger at Sesqui, when I did a tour there and we were working with Rivian, he was very excited about it. He has folks who will come and use the park just so they can get a charge. So they're walking their dogs, they're coming every day, and they get a very quick charge and off they go.
Awesome. Related to, I'm thinking maybe related to the statewide public-private collaboration work that, is one of the 4 components. Do you know if hosting capacity, utility capacity maps have been created for South Carolina?
That was not, if I remember correctly, in the recommendations, I don't believe that was something that was necessarily contemplated. It was maybe more at a higher level about sharing information. And so hosting capacity maps could have been, part of that working group discussion. It isn't a specific recommendation.
Okay. Just building on Vice Chair Powers' comment about some of us having been at a NAROC event, that's one of, I think the state of Rhode Island and Michigan all have those, so that the various players can, identify where there's capacity now and in the future.
Very helpful tool. I agree.
Okay. Did interoperability come up? That seems like that's more of a market question than a state government kind of question, but I'm just curious.
And that's where you see the development of minimum standards, is that interoperability discussion between the manufacturers of EVs, the owners of EVs, and then both the utilities and the charging companies. Really being able to scrape the data in a uniform manner, so you can see charging behavior, hours used, and then for an owner of an EV to just know that the connection is there, it's going to charge their vehicle. So yes, standardization was something that we heard from folks quite a bit.
Do you have optimism about it?
Well, I don't.
Based on what you've heard?
Yeah, there was a lot of collaborative discussion and positive collaborative discussion, I recall, in the stakeholder working group. I think, true interoperability standards would need to come from the federal government. To be, something that if you're traversing our state into another state and all of a sudden you roll into someone else's interoperability standards, necessarily that might not be great. And for those folks doing business across the nation, having it at the federal level would be preferred.
And you referenced the DOT allowable ex parte that we heard earlier this month. Do you have anything to add on the challenge of rural accessibility and federal highways?
I don't. No, I agree with them.
Okay. I think I have just a couple more questions. With the agnostic information tool that that ORS will be preparing and sharing, have you experienced any misinformation that's kind of like what we experienced with solar rollout? Is there, because you all have played a key role in kind of sharing good information and reliable information and what to look for and not to look for the consumer. Is that a relevant question in this regard?
Yeah, we find having that agnostic data source, which is just kind of compiles all of the information. Of course, we will sift through it for true, kind of sales type driven. That's not information that we necessarily provide to the general public. We will compile, lists of businesses that are registered to do business with, of course, a large disclaimer, that says that, we don't endorse any of these, but that's a service that the general public has asked of the Energy Office in the past, who, to your point, who installs solar. What we do tend to do is focus on trade groups. If you have more questions about EV charging companies, you can reach out to their trade group, and then we'll put a link to that. But we find that being a government entity, we can be counted on as a trusted source for information, and we're selective about the type of information that we'll provide to the public. We do get calls all the time about different things they've read on Facebook, heard an ad that the government is giving away money for X, Y, and Z, and they do, consumers will call the Energy Office, which is wonderful, and we'll be able to quickly debunk that and then give them information that they can make decisions based upon.
Great. You mentioned the port, and that also made me think of fleets and EVs. And is there anything you can add in that realm that this report covers?
There is a discussion about fleet electrification, and I think a focused recommendation on that. The Energy Office has worked with fleets across the state to inform and educate them on the benefits of all alternative fuels and EVs specifically. What we're seeing is some fleets are, their ownership or investors are looking at their own, environmental impacts and requiring certain types of transition to electrification. And then also if they're part of a large supply chain, say for BMW, there are requirements for a reduction of carbon emissions by certain dates.
And my last question, is the technical college system a key player or involved in the education associated with the workforce?
They have been a wonderful partner. They were raising the issue and wanting it to get attention in the working groups. They're part of the governor's executive order working group. Okay. And so we look forward to continued collaboration with them.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All of your answers.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioners, any further questions?
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Urban?
Thank you. We appreciate you coming today and informing us about the stakeholder group, the working group, and thank you for your report. I look forward to studying it. I'm wondering, did you all reach out to Tesla after they announced that they were going to open up their charging their nationwide charging stations to non-Tesla vehicles. Have you been in contact with them and to find out what that plan would entail?
Thank you for that that question, Commissioner. I don't believe we have. I believe that is a fairly recent announcement by Tesla. Our work to produce a report ended in 2022. We have had some questions about the transition of opening up those charging stations. I have not had any direct knowledge of that.
Will the report be updated periodically? Is there a plan to try and update it annually, or do you know?
We do not intend to update the report annually. It really is a snapshot in time of work done by folks, but we are required under Act 46 to convene the stakeholders every 2 years and report on that. So I think naturally every 2 years, as we're convening stakeholders, we're going to start with the report as it's written, take a look at those recommendations. Hopefully we'll be able to cross some off the list and then report what is left or if there are any new recommendations that come out.
Very good. I'm wondering, you may have mentioned it, and I just didn't hear it, but did the Municipal Association of South Carolina participate and try and represent the cities and towns' interest?
Yes, they did. We had both members of the Municipal Association and then the individual cities and counties that were interested. We had quite a large contingent of public entities involved.
Good. And I assume probably the Association of Counties participated as well?
Yes, they did.
And the co-ops?
Yes.
Good. I understand that the city of Rock Hill has electrified all of their city buses. And I'm wondering, did that come up at all when you were talking about maybe larger vehicles?
It did. Under the equity and accessibility working group, I believe there is a recommendation or discussion about electrification in public transit to include not only buses, but then also looking at potentially supports for e-bike, transition to e-bike in communities where a vehicle financially might be out of reach for some.
Very good. And did the name Proterra come up? Because they're in my district up in Greenville County. They of course are manufacturing buses, and I believe that's where Rock Hill purchased their city buses from. Did you all have them in the stakeholder group?
Yes, Commissioner. Proterra has been a wonderful stakeholder even before the initiative kicked off, and they were part of the stakeholder groups.
Very good. And you mentioned BMW. I know they've taken a big interest in electric vehicles, and also I believe Michelin has as well. Were they a part of the group?
Either they were a part of the group or a representative of kind of similar size or a trade group that they were part of was representing them. I don't know offhand. I don't have the list in front of me, but you can find the full list of stakeholders in the appendices.
Very good. And some states have taken the initiative to transition some of their diesel school buses to cleaner EV buses. Was the South Carolina Department of Education part of the process?
They were part of the process for the stakeholder initiative. Under the federal funding that's become available, there is grant funding for the transition to EV buses, and they have, I believe, put in for that grant funding, and they also have transitioned to some other alternative fuels under the Volkswagen settlement with the Department of Insurance.
Very good. That was going to be another question I had, so you anticipated that. Well, it sounds like you covered all the bases, and we certainly appreciate your efforts, and please extend to all the stakeholders and partners our gratitude to the Commission for your willingness to serve in this capacity. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Commissioner Caston?
Just a follow-up question, if I may, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Yep. relative to a question Commissioner Carolee Williams had, and I'm looking at the study, but I can't find the page numbers. It may just be cut off, but it's the part about the state parks. Did I understand you to say that there is no charge to anyone can come into the park and use these charging stations at State Park?
For the 3 charging stations that the ORS Energy Office funded, those state parks are offering charging at no charge to their folks that come in to use the park. On the Rivian chargers, the state, if I understand correctly, the state parks have an option to charge for the services or not charge for the services. And I don't know what Parks, Rec, and Tourism had decided related to whether or not they'll be charging customers. I don't know that answer.
Okay. So if I was born and reared in Chester, we have a state park there, and you know, you just drive in it, we drive Jeeps in and generally behave. But there was no fee or anything for us to get into that park, go fishing or do whatever. And honestly, I don't know if there is now. I haven't been there in a while. But I guess what I was wondering, and it just didn't tell me here, if anyone can drive off the road and
yeah, I don't know, and you wouldn't find that in the stakeholder report. You'll find mention of the Rivian effort and just a few details, but it doesn't go into great detail because that is number one, it didn't come out of the stakeholder group. It's just ancillary information about what's happening in the state. And number two, Parks, Rec, and Tourism, that department is handling that relationship. The Energy Office brokered the relationship. Rivian reached out to us, and over a period of time, we networked them with Parks, Rec, and Tourism and made some demonstrations based on the equipment that the Energy Office had funded for the park system. But after that, we're not part of the agreement between those two entities.
all right, because all I saw was just that paragraph, and it didn't, so I didn't know
Yes,
if there
sir.
was any more information.
That is the mention.
So the state parks may or may not charge for it, and I assume if they don't charge for it, it just comes out of their budget.
Correct.
And their budget is paid by whom?
I believe taxpayers.
And if there's a gas station or whatever across the street that may have these, would they be in competition with them perhaps?
That that is beyond anything we did in the stakeholder
It's
group.
not in here.
I couldn't tell you.
Understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Ms. Hipp, thank you very much for your presentation. Let's just check. Ms. Given, do you have anything that we need to clean up before
No,
we
Madam Chair.
leave?
Thank you.
Mr. Regal, do you have anything that we need to address before we close? Okay, thank you. Ms. Hipp and Ms. Given, thank you all for being here today. We certainly appreciate the information you've provided. And with that, we will close this allowable ex parte briefing. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.